Hi, everybody. I'm Gary Sassaman, the Curatorial Director of the Comic-Con Museum, and it's my pleasure today to be here to talk to two gentlemen who have written a recent book on one of my favorite topics, and there's only one way to say it, Bond, James Bond. So I'm about to introduce you to Mark Altman and Edward Gross, who are the authors of Nobody Does It Better, the complete, uncensored, unauthorized history of James Bond, which just came out a few months ago. So Mark is the producer, writer of the fan-beloved film Free Enterprise, and he's been involved with television shows such as The Librarians, Castle, and is currently the showrunner and EP of CW's Pandora. But he is, of course, best known to Comic-Con and WonderCon fans as the captain of Starship SmackDown, a long-running Sunday afternoon program that provides heated debate on which is the best starship in all the galaxies. Ed Gross is an author with a long history in genre magazines, including Starlog, Cinefantastique, and Cinescape, and he's the co-author of a series of books, pop culture oral history books, that are based on Star Trek, Battlestar Galactica, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and of course the James Bond book we're discussing today, which Mark and Ed have written together. So, guys, say hello.
Hello.
Gary, you said that there's only one way to say Bond, James Bond, but that's unless you're Timothy Dalton in the beginning of Living Daylights, where apparently it's Bond, James Bond.
Yeah. You know what? That was just on like Epix TV or something over the weekend, and I caught it just in time. I read that in the book, and I caught it just in time to see him actually do that on the boat with the woman he drops in on. So yeah, it was kind of dismissive.
Very curious guy.
Boat now. Life is so boring, Margot. It's like being in quarantine, except she was on a beautiful yacht off the Gibraltar. Anyway, good to be here, Gary. Thanks for having us. We love to talk about James Bond too, shockingly enough.
Absolutely.
So, we can't really have a discussion about James Bond without talking about Ian Fleming a little bit, the man who created James Bond. He was an upper crust Brit whose experience in naval intelligence in World War II definitely informed his later fiction writing. He was also a journalist. He wrote a Bond novel each year, starting in 1952 with Casino Royale and continuing until his death in 1964. All total, he wrote 12 novels and 2 short story novella collections. And he's highly regarded by the London Times as number 14 on their list of 50 greatest British authors since 1945. And the Bond books have sold over 100 million copies worldwide, making the character one of the best-selling series of fictional books of all time. So, but we're here today to talk about the movies. And from the very beginning, Fleming was interested in getting James Bond into the movies or television. The actual first appearance of James Bond was on American television, I think in like 1954.
CBS Climax Mystery Theater. It was back in the day of the kinescopes, where it was performed live. And probably the most notable thing about it, Barry Nelson played Card Shark Jimmy Bond in American. And anyone who's seen it, the best thing about it is Peter Lorre plays Le Chiffre. And obviously, Peter Lorre is always wonderful in anything he does, and this is no exception. It's extremely limited because of the nature of live television at the time, and of course the restrictions. But it's still, worth seeing for the Bond completist. And it's hard to get a hold of, but I believe on Casino Royale, the old 1967 version, they also had it on that DVD, Blu-ray, and interestingly enough, Felix Leiter is the American in Climax Mystery Theater, and it was a great disappointment to Fleming. He had really hoped that movies and television would be the future of James Bond, and after this aired and sort of didn't really make much of an impact, he felt that potentially the future of James Bond in the media was over. I mean, you got to remember, he always he was sort of looked down on by his upper crust buddies. He went to fancy boarding school. He was as you mentioned, in naval intelligence. James Bond was kind of in a way the man he wished he could be. Informed by his experiences during the war, but Fleming, drank too much, he smoked too much, he messed around with women too much. So basically, Bond was sort of an extension of him. But you know, it's funny to hear him be the 14th greatest British author of all time, because of course when he first started publishing these, he was really looked down upon for doing something beneath his social station. You know, it was considered pulp and just the, you know, the worst, too violent and too much sex, and just, you know, something, you know, really not worthy of his talents.
He was also determined at that time, as he was writing the novels, he knew the real money lay in the adaptations. He knew that films or TV, and it would be the way to go to make real money. And he was trying to option those books out and trying to get the deal going with Kevin McClory in the 50s for a James Bond movie. I mean, so he was really hungry for a James Bond movie, even willing to accept Jimmy Stewart as James Bond if Hitchcock directed a version.
Yeah, it came back and really bit him in the butt, as they say, because of course anyone who expressed an interest, he wanted to believe. It was like he was Fox Mulder. I want to believe. So he believed that they could do it. So Alexander Korda optioned it. You know, later on, Casino Royale was optioned. But the most infamous was when Kevin McClory and wanted to do the James Bond movies, and they ended up developing a story together with Jack Whittingham that became Thunderball. And ultimately, when that didn't bear any fruit, Fleming adapted that story they collaborated on into the novel Thunderball, which led to huge litigation, and ultimately Kevin McClory getting the rights, the movie rights to Thunderball, which eventually would lead to much litigation over the years, and of course, Never Say Never Again, an existential threat to the James Bond franchise, you know, basically Eon didn't get the rights back to Spectre and to until many years, you know, after McClory's death. I mean, McClory was like Don Quixote, tilting at windmills, always trying to launch his own James Bond franchise, you know, unsuccessfully, of course. Although he did get to produce Thunderball, it was the only way that they could bring him into the fold, since he had the Thunderball rights and didn't want him to compete with the official James Bond movies.
So let's talk a little bit about Eon, because that's everything or nothing. And it was Albert Cubby Broccoli and Harry Saltzman. And as the way I understand it, the Broccoli family is the family that brought broccoli from Italy to the United States. So we depending on how you feel about broccoli, the vegetable, we owe him either thanks or hatred for that, but we certainly owe him thanks for that family shepherding the James Bond legacy on film for over 50 years now.
They continue to this very day. And it's really a remarkable story because, of course, Cubby Broccoli was interested in the Bond rights. And at the time, he was partnered with Guy Irvin Allen, and not Irwin Allen, Irving Allen. And they, unfortunately, they didn't get the rights, mostly because of Irving Allen's sort of uncouthness. And a guy named Harry Saltzman ended up, but he couldn't set the movies up, and he was running out of time. The license was going to expire soon. He paid a great deal of money, and found out, thanks to Wolf Mankiewicz, who would become important later on as a screenwriter for some of these films, that Cubby Broccoli was interested. And Cubby had great relationships. He had a deal with Columbia Pictures and also great relationship with the United Artists. And he came at the last second, and they partnered together, sort of shotgun marriage between Saltzman and Cubby. And they were able to get United Artists to come on board and produce what ultimately became Dr. No for really what was deemed a pittance at the time, a little over $1 million.
So let's talk about the films, and we decided in advance that the best way to do this is to talk about them via actor. There's 6 actors that have played James Bond in the movies over the last 50-some years. So let's start with, I'm going to go ahead and say it, the best James Bond, Sean Connery, who did start the role with Dr. No in 1962.
Go ahead, Ed.
Well, I mean, one of the things I want to say about the Connery era, and I think it sort of set the mold for the series as it went on, in the sense of when you start with Dr. No and From Russia with Love, you've got a more serious James Bond in a lot of ways. You know, they're more adventures, but also espionage thrillers, really. And then you get into Goldfinger with that wonderful car, the Aston Martin with the ejector seat. And what happens is you watch as the Connery era goes on, it starts off very serious, but then as they try to please the audience, it becomes lighter and lighter and lighter, to the point where you get to, skipping over on Her Majesty's Secret Service, Diamonds Are Forever, which is just out there completely. And what that does is it sets up a cycle for these films, I feel anyway, that when you bring an actor in, it starts off very serious, and then the series gets cartoony and eventually grounds itself again. And to me, that's
Well,
one
what's
of the
amazing about the Bond franchise is how elastic it is and how it's a self-correcting franchise, as Ed says. So you have something that gets as ludicrous as, and I love it. You Only Live Twice, with giant volcanoes and monorails and stuff, and then it's much more grounded in Her Majesty's Secret Service. Or you do a Moonraker where Bond literally goes into space and they realize they've gone too far, and it becomes, much smaller and more espionage based in something like For Your Eyes Only. And the same thing happens again with Die Another Day, where you have him, a laser weapon and James Bond paragliding over the, Iceland, and it's absolutely ludicrous. And you figure out, can Bond survive this insanity? And then the next film is very restrained and most wonderful Casino Royale. So it's amazing if you look how Bond treads different genres. I mean, it starts as a very grounded espionage franchise. I mean, Dr. No, and particularly From Russia with Love, are classic 60s spy thrillers. And it's really with the emergence of Paul Den, a good, your guy, Paul Den, because of course Ed is one of the foremost experts on Planet of the Apes. Paul Den, who went on and wrote the many of the Planet of the Apes movies, who brings this fanciful element to the Bond movies, because Richard Maybaum was not that guy. Every time Bond went big, it was really someone else. It was a Roald Dahl or Paul Den or Christopher Wood. Maybaum was much more grounded in his storytelling. And of course, until Purvis and Wade, he probably wrote more Bond movies than anyone. He was virtually involved in almost every James Bond movie until, he was sent packing after License to Kill.
So between the two of you, what's your favorite Connery film?
Well,
go ahead, Mark.
Well, I was going to say, the thing about Connery, and you said it yourself, you smiled and said the best Bond. I would not argue that. In fact, I love every actor who's played Bond, thankfully. There hasn't been there've been better Bonds and worse Bonds, the best being Sean Connery, of course. But I'd have to say From Russia with Love, because I feel that, his, the antagonist, Robert Shaw, as Red Grant, is phenomenal. Lata Lenya as Rosa Klebb. It's grounded. Istanbul is exotic and interesting. It's a spy thriller, nail-biting spy thriller. I love Daniela Bianchi, who's beautiful as the Bond girl, and the whole plot. And it's really the last of the really grounded Bond movies before it starts to get, big and fanciful. Which isn't to say I don't love Goldfinger, because of course, who doesn't love Goldfinger? And then Thunderball has a soft spot in my heart, because I know a lot of people think the water stuff is lethargic, but it has some of my favorite moments of all time, and one of the great villains in Fiona Volpe, played by Luciano Paluzzi, and that great line, I think he got the point. Some of the best puns. Do you mind if my date sits this one out? She's just dead. I think Thunderball sometimes gets a bad rap, and even director Terrence Young, it was his least favorite Bond movie. But you have to really put yourself in the time period. What they did at the end of Thunderball was just as spectacular as the end of Endgame now. I mean, that was all done practically. There's no green screen. It's unbelievable what they achieved. And yes, underwater is slow, but to see that for the first time, it's pretty spectacular. And then, of course, You Only Live Twice, for all its problems, is a triumph of production design. Ken Adam and, of course, the composer John Barry. I mean, that volcano base is the greatest set ever built for a movie, and it really takes James Bond to another level. So I'm a fan, really, honestly, of all the Sean Connery movies, but From Russia with Love is probably my favorite.
Yeah,
I would be the cliche, and Gold with Goldfinger. It's always been my favorite of the Connery movies, and I think it's because it walks that line between the thriller and the sort of getting out there action adventure. Or Goldfinger's an amazing villain. Odd Job, an amazing henchman. Shirley Eaton painted it gold. Hello. And Connery is just at the top of his game. And he was great in Dr. No, From Russia with Love, but he really hones it in, I feel, in this one. Having fun with the seriousness, throwing the guy in the tub at the beginning and throwing the fan in there. It's like, shocking, positively shocking, and all that. to me, and the quips are great too. Where's Goldfinger playing his golden harp? You know, I mean, it's corny, but it's great. So to me, that's the real standout. Thunderball has a warm place in my heart only because it's one of my first 2 movie memories ever. The Beatles' Help is the first one, and then Bond and the Traction Machine and Thunderball is the second movie memory that I have.
James Bond movie in a way. I mean, it's the Beatles doing a James Bond movie.
Exactly.
The opening track of the theatrical version of Help has an homage to Vic Flick, the guitar riff, that starts Help. Help's a super, there's so many movies that were inspired by the Bond franchise. Help, most notable, but of course, Harry Saltzman went off and did the Harry Palmer movies with Michael Caine, which are terrific, which is sort of like, what if Bond had continued in the From Russia with Love vein? But even that gets crazy with a $1 Billion Brain. And, you have the Flint movies with James Coburn. And it's just, it's amazing how big and impactful Bond was in the 60s. We think it's a major franchise now, but really James Bond owned the 60s. James Bond, the Beatles, owned it. You talk about the British invasion. It was James Bond, the Beatles, and the Rolling Stones. And, quite a remarkable decade, for pop culture. And, we contributed with Star Trek. So, the Americans. So, but it's really remarkable. And I think we're also, I don't mean to overlook Dr. No, because I think Dr. No is an amazing movie. It set the tone. I think there's some great stuff in Dr. No. I love Joseph Wiseman as the titular Dr. No. He's so great. I thought you less stupid, Mr. Bond, but I see now you're nothing but a stupid policeman. I mean, it set the tone for every Bond villain, and Joseph Wiseman is spectacular. And of course, what can you say about Ursula Andress? I mean, the ultimate, the definitive, the iconic Bond girl, coming out of the water. It's something that obviously 50 years later, Halle Berry was paying homage to, and Die Another Day. I don't think it's anything that any of us, especially men of a certain age, will ever forget.
Well, they also kind of flipped it with Casino Royale and had Daniel Craig come out of the water.
Yes, that's true.
So, but eventually Connery did get sick of doing it, mainly because I think, he didn't get along with the producers and also the paparazzi at that time, and especially when they did You Only Live Twice in Japan, really got to him, and he left. And what happened next was George Lazenby.
Mm-hmm. I mean, Sean Connery had people accosting him in the bathroom, taking pictures in Japan. He had it, and he didn't think he was making enough money. He wanted to be a partner, and he was tired because they were making these movies a year, one a year at first. Dr. No, From Russia with Love, Goldfinger were all 1962, 63, 60, and Thunderball. It's insane. But yeah, and then so Connery angles. Now they have to find out, is this franchise Sean Connery or is it James Bond? Well, clearly it's James Bond, because they cast George Lazenby, a very polarizing figure. I personally liked him quite a bit. He's no Sean Connery. He didn't have the acting chops, but he's a very credible James Bond in a wonderful James Bond script with probably the best of the actresses until Eva Green to ever play a Bond girl, which is Diana Rigg as Tracy Vincenzo. And it's a spectacular film, beautifully directed by Peter Hunt, and gorgeously lensed as well. It's an acquired taste. A lot of people don't like the film, but pound for pound, it's probably one of the best Bond movies of the whole series.
I would also say that, the big cliche about On Her Majesty's Secret Service is people always say, oh man, if Sean Connery had played Bond in that movie, it would have been the best one ever. But the truth of the matter is, if Sean Connery was sticking around, they wouldn't have done On Her Majesty's Secret Service. Certainly not in the way they did. In this more grounded, they would have just continued in the vein of You Only Live Twice and Thunderball and just gotten it bigger. There's nothing to believe.
That someone said in our book, which I thought was a good point, that Sean Connery would never have the vulnerability to play that role.
Yes.
Lazenby, that last scene, spoiler alert, when she's shot by Blofeld and is crying over her body and says, we have all the time in the world. You could never see Connery doing that. He would never expose that kind of vulnerability. He was a blunt instrument in much the way, that Daniel Craig would be many years later. And so, this whole idea that, Sean Connery had done it because he's a much better actress, it would have been, the greatest Bond movie of all time. I'm not sure that stands up to scrutiny, but it would be fascinating to see in an alternate universe if Sean Connery wasn't Our Majesty's Secret. And we may yet see that because, if you listen to a lot of people, the rumor is No Time to Die is very influenced by on Her Majesty's Secret Service. So it'll be interesting to see Daniel Craig do that role if the rumors are to be believed.
I think also George Lazenby defied the odds in the sense of the movie holds up for many people. As like Mark said, it's a polarizing film, but it holds up for many people. He stepped into what has got to be the most unenviable position you could, stepping into Sean Connery's position as James Bond. And I feel he handled it well. I'm not saying he was a perfect James Bond, but him combined with Peter Hunter's director and the script by Richard Maybaum, it just was the perfect combination to make that movie an extremely solid and a standout, really, from the ones that had recently preceded it.
Yeah, it was the Kobayashi Maru. It was the no-win scenario. You know, anybody who stepped into that role after Connery, you know, had a thankless task ahead of them. It just so happened it was lazy favors because, you know, he was a brat. You know, he felt a sense of entitlement. He was a male model who was always already making a lot of money, and you know, he didn't realize what incredible luck he had, and that he should appreciate it and appreciate the people around him who were trying to make him look good. So he alienated a lot of people. So he did himself no favors. And, you know, in that sense, it's unfortunate because, of course, it would have been interesting to see what a second or third or fourth movie with George Lazenby would have been like.
But ultimately, he decided not to come back, right?
Well, it depends who you ask. You know, it's like Rashomon, the history of Bond. You know, he says it was Ronan O'Reilly who did not want him back, and that the producers offered him $1 million, which he turned down. You know, you talk to the producers and they're like, you know, life's too short. He was a nightmare to work with. The grosses are down. You know, the studio wanted to go with the safe choice. Who knows what the real story is? You know, everybody's writing their own history. I mean, I love that Becoming Bond documentary as much as anybody, but there's so much in there that's apocryphal. It's unbelievable.
So Connery was lured back to do one more movie in 1971, Diamonds Are Forever, which to me, I just watched that a few weeks ago. It almost seems to me to be the precursor of the Roger Moore era, because it really seems to be like Ed said earlier, it's really kind of out there, and it would have fit better. I mean, the Mustang going on its side wheels and everything through the alleyway with Roger Moore, I think.
It really is the first Roger Moore. There's a reason it's the first Bond movie of the 70s. And it's interesting because it's, you know, Mankiewicz's script, it's Sean Connery's favorite script. And you could tell that, you know, because when Connery starts to have more creative say, you get Diamonds Are Forever, and then later Never Say Never Again, which is an absurd, campy mess. And so maybe Connery's, you know, opinion of what Bond isn't exactly the best judge. Because of course, Diamonds Forever. I loved Diamonds Are Forever as a kid. When it was on ABC Sunday Night Movie, I was thrilled. I always got a kick out of it. I liked the, you know, Charles Gray as Blofeld. I like Baja. We don't have a, you know, thing in Baja. You know, there's so much I liked about it. But you know, in the cold light of day now, you know, it is not one of my favorite Bond movies. It's ridiculous and it's goofy, and Sean Connery doesn't look great. You know, you can tell he's doing it for the money. And you know, it's just it's goofy and campy. And if I want to see a goofy, campy Bond movie, I'll watch a Roger Moore movie and enjoy it, I think, a lot more.
Music is great in that movie, by the way.
Music's great. Yeah, and Wynton Hoot, you know, Mr. Wynton and Mr. Kidd, you know, Putter and Glover, you know, are terrific. You know, they're fun little, and you know, which isn't to say like any movie, like any Bond movie, even the worst of the Bond movies, there's always something enjoyable. You know, Jill St. John as Tiffany Case, I think she's terrific. I mean, it's you know, Peter Franks. I mean, there's and that wonderful fight in the elevator, which is one of the best fights since the train car in From Russia with Love, because it's claustrophobic rather than this giant fight. They're in a little elevator, and they have this fight in the middle of, you know, this tiny, you know, which is great. It's claustrophobic and violent and cool, and so again, you know, despite whatever flaws, of which there are many, you know, I was just out walking my pet rat. I mean, awful, but it's you know, it's still a fun you know, movie, and it's great to see Sean Connery in the role. You know, I would say the last time, because of course he comes back for the unofficial Bond movie, Never Say Never Again, in 1983, but the last of the Eon movies of his.
I think too, you mentioned music a number of times, so I think we should pause here and mention John Barry, and what a huge impact he's had on the first at least 20 years of James Bond films with his musical scores.
You can't underestimate the importance of John Barry to that franchise. Monty Norman gets credit for the theme, but it was orchestrated by John Barry. He made it into what it is, one of the most iconic pieces of music of all time. What he did with his scores cannot be understated. It gave the Bond films life. It gave it scope. It gave it, just a kinetic sense of movement. And, he continues long after he died to be a huge influence on the Bond movies because, of course, David Arnold, his protege, continued in his many films, that great John Barry sound, which helped elevate the Pierce movies. And the absence of John Barry is really felt in movies like Michael Kamen did the score to License to Kill. And of course, GoldenEye, that train wreck of a score by Eric Serra, they went back weeks before the movie opened and had his orchestrator, John Altman, no relation, actually rewrite a piece of music to include the John Barry music 007 in the tank chase to make it work. And it did. And you feel it. Like when it's finally you hear the Bond theme, it's like something's working. You felt it was missing before so it's just, you can't, there are two people you cannot underestimate, which is John Barry and Ken Adam, the production designer of many of the early Bonds, were instrumental in building the foundations for this franchise, which is why 55 years or whatever it is later, we're still talking about it, still obsessed by it, still love it.
Absolutely.
So let's move on to the man who was James Bond the most times, Roger Moore.
Well, I would say that, here's my thing with James Bond. I'm following James Bond, whoever's playing him. I don't care. In the one way, ever since I was a kid, Roger Moore's James Bond? Okay, I'm going to go with him. That being said, Live and Let Die is, lighter Bond, but in the vein of Diamonds Are Forever in a lot of ways. I like it. It's got a lot of really good stuff in it. I can't stand The Man with the Golden Gun. It makes fun of Bond, and that was a big problem with Moore, I think, in those early films. It took things so lightly. Bond is swallowing a bullet and making jokes about, how the bullet's going to get out of his body, and it's just silly. He's just made a fool in Man with the Golden Gun, and to me, that was a real turnoff. Obviously, I was still going to continue with the series, but that to me, when his second movie is still probably my least liked James Bond movie, or one of them. But then you get Spy Who Loved Me, where he comes into his own. He remakes You Only Live Twice, a much better version of You Only Live Twice, but he makes Bond his own guy. Yes, it's the lightness of Roger Moore, but there's enough of toughness mixed in there that he walks that balancing line between being too light, and certainly he's not going to be too heavy with it. And even has some genuine emotions, like when Barbara Bach brings up the death of his wife. And to me, that's like a very real moment where he reacts and he kind of shuts her off and says, all right, you've made your point. And it moves
sensitive
on.
About certain things, yes.
That's right. So that's it, basically. And then, Moonrakers, to me, there's a lot of great stuff. I remember seeing it in Manhattan on 70 millimeter, that opening scene where Bond's thrown out of a plane without a parachute. But then they have Jaws flapping his arms looking foolish. And that's where they lose me. And there's a lot of foolish humor in Moonraker that turns me off, even though there's a lot of really good stuff in it. So Your Eyes Only, as I was saying earlier, roots things again. Gives Roger Moore one of his toughest moments of Bond, kicking a car off a cliff, which is just, awesome with the bad guy in it. And then A View to a Kill, Octopussy's fun. And then is a fun one, sort of moving back up into Roger Moore's silliness again. And then A View to a Kill is just, it's got Christopher Walken. It's got that opening theme by Duran Duran. And that's about it. So.
Yeah, I grew up on the Roger Moore Bond movies, so I have a soft spot in my heart for it. I like the Roger Moore movies and appreciate them in a totally different way than I appreciate like the Sean Connery Bond movies. The first Bond movie I ever saw was The Man with the Golden Gun. And it's amazing I ever went to see another one, because now it's probably one of my least favorite Bond movies. It's basically, it looks cheap. It is cheap. It's not well written. The Solex agitator is a ridiculous MacGuffin. But, Live and Let Die, it has Jane Seymour. Yaphet Kotto's terrific in it. It's still finding, who Roger Moore is what his strengths are as Bond, and being Connery is not them. Being charming and being no coward and sort of wafting his way through misadventure, that's really Roger Moore. And so Live and Let Die has highs, it has lows. Jeffrey Holder, terrific, and Man with the Golden Gun, the less said the better. But it really is in that third film, as he said, much like Goldfinger was Connery's third film, Spy Love Me, Roger Moore connects with the role in a big way, and it's a wonderful movie. It's one of my favorite Bond movies. It works on all levels. Marvin Hamlish does the score. It's adequate, beautiful, great song. We named our book after it. Nobody does it better, obviously. One of the most famous Bond songs, even though it's not Shirley Bassey, but it's spectacular. And then Moonraker, probably the most polarizing of all the Bond movies. People either hate it or I'm one of those people who says, yes, it's ridiculous. Yes, it's absurd. And I love it for the most part. Everything Ed said is true. It undermines itself at every turn. It has a spectacular parachuting scene, but then it has Jaws flapping his wings. There's this great stuff with Hugo Drax where they're pheasant hunting, where there's this man in the tree who's about to kill Bond, and Bond shoots him out of the tree, and he's supposed to be shooting a pheasant. And Drax says, "You missed, Mr. Bond." And he said, "Did I?" And the guy falls out of the tree. And then he sends his Dobermans to kill Corinne Clary. And there's a great John Barry score, and it's beautifully shot. And it's like, wow, this is like some of the best stuff in Bond ever. But then you have, look, Bond going into space because they were trying to cash in on Star Wars. And it's spectacular Derek Meddings effects in camera. It's not even optical printed. It's like it's stunning. It's amazing what they did. But it's Bond going into space and having a laser battle. I mean, it's You Only Live Twice and Spy Love Me recycled again. So, but look, had Bond continued in direction, the franchise would be over. Then you have For Your Eyes Only, overrated, but nice to get back to basics. Topol is good, but there's not a strong villain in Christados. But it's fine. Octopussy is an interesting match between the espionage thrillers of the past and the sort of over-the-top movies of contemporary Roger Moore Bond. And then View to Kill is just awful. I mean, it's one Bond film too many. I know a lot of people grew up on that one. They love it. But other than the Duran Duran song, there's very little to recommend about that movie. It's the plot of Superman the movie. They're going to drop, Silicon Valley and create beachfront property. I mean, I'm waiting for Lex Luthor to show up in that. It's a travesty. But again, still some fun scenes here and there. It's not without its pleasures, its slight pleasures, however slight.
Well, you brought up the Moonraker thing. One thing I just want to say real quick is that, Moonraker is one of 3 Bond movies where it feels like they changed directors and writers in the middle of the movie. Because in Moonraker, you talk about the scene where the dogs attack her, and then as soon as it switches to, what is it, Vienna or something, it goes crazy.
The double take pigeon.
The double take pigeons and the gondola on the street, it goes nuts. License to Kill does the same thing. It starts off as this very serious thing, and it gets goofier and goofier as it goes on in a lot of ways. And Die Another Day starts off, amazing. And you think, oh my God, this is going to be one of the best Bonds ever. And it becomes this goof fest. I mean, just with invisible cars and all kinds of nonsense. So, anyway,
the schizophrenia.
Started with Moonraker, though. That was the first one.
But the schizophrenia of some of these movies where they start, you see, they start off grounded, and by the end they become, ridiculously over the top. But that was characteristic of the entire Roger Moore era, and the Timothy Dalton era was a response to Roger Moore. It said, we're going to be more serious, we're going to be more edgy, we're going to be more grounded. For all of those who interviewed Timothy Dalton during that time, you couldn't do an interview with him without him talking about, I read all the books, Bond is a killer first and foremost. He wanted you to know he was not Roger Moore, and he took this very seriously with a capital S. And look, for a lot of people, he's their favorite Bond actor. I don't dislike him. He's not my favorite. He's not my second or third favorite. But I understand why people like him. In a way, it was sort of a test case for Daniel Craig. Daniel Craig, sort of took what Timothy Dalton sort of, tried to do and then perfected it. It's an interesting 2 films. Living Daylights is very dated because, of course, you have the Taliban as the heroes, teaming up with James Bond. But, Mariam Diallo is an interesting character. But again, not a strong villain. Whitaker's not a very good villain. Is he the villain? Is Jerome Crabb the villain? But there's that wonderful scene where they break into the safe house. So and the last John Barry score. So it's not without its joys, but it's also the big, John Glenn. It was probably time to mix up the directors at that point, because John Glenn is still directing it like he was directing the Roger Moore movies. And, you see later on when Martin Campbell comes, it's a much, the movies needed to evolve visually. And License to Kill to me is one of the worst Bond movies. It's basically a glorified Miami Vice episode. And there's an interesting idea at the heart of that film where Bond has to sort of go undercover and befriend the villain and then ultimately betray him. And he's on revenge, this revenge, which became sort of de rigueur for Daniel Craig many years later. But at the time it was sort of fresh, with Bond going, rogue on his own mission after Felix Leiter is maimed by a shark. But ultimately it doesn't work. And the biggest problem is the studio doesn't believe in it anymore. They're not putting enough money in. It looks cheap. It was not shot in England. They didn't spend enough money. The performances are terrible. It's John Glenn's swan song, and he seems to be phoning it in. It just doesn't work for me.
So by this time, during the Roger Moore era, Saltzman was out. He sold out his interest in the James Bond property.
Yeah, after Golden Gun. Mm-hmm.
So the Broccoli family was in charge. Cubby eventually brings in his daughter, Barbara, and I guess it's his stepson, Michael G. Wilson.
Yeah.
And those two are still shepherding the franchise to this day. But it's obvious from our discussion here and from reading the book that the producers regularly catered the movies to the actor. Roger Moore's stuff is much lighter, and Timothy Dalton's is much more serious. And they also eventually put the brakes on things, like they did after Moonraker into For Your Eyes Only. And when they ultimately picked Timothy Dalton to be the successor to Roger Moore, those movies were deemed as being much more serious for the very reasons that, Mark, you said, that Dalton himself wanted them to be more serious. But Dalton only lasted for 2 movies.
Part of that is, I think, because of the seriousness. Because of the fact, if you had seen Dalton in The Rocketeer, where he played the villain, but he was full of humor, he was charming, he was everything he wasn't as James Bond. He brought the seriousness, but he didn't bring any of the humor that Connery and all the others brought to it as well. There's a bit in License to Kill where he throws a guy in a tray of maggots and slams the drawer closed. And his line is, bon appetit, in this very serious, whereas Connery would have winked, said, bon appetit, as he shut the drawer. It always made me think that if Timothy Dalton went to Burger King, he'd be like, I'd like a burger, hold the ketchup. Just this very serious, and every line has got import in it. And to me, I think it just turned people off. This was not the James Bond they wanted to see.
Yeah. And had there been a third Timothy Dalton, the plan was to make it bigger, and it had all these set pieces, big set piece at Hoover Dam where there was secret arms cache. There was going to be a love scene on a whitewater rapids. It took place in Hong Kong. It was the idea was to sort of do the Spy Who Loved Me Goldfinger thing, where they would have gone bigger and more elaborate and gotten away from, but of course that never happened. There never was a Bond 17 with Timothy Dalton.
So there was a gap in between the last Timothy Dalton movie, which I believe was 89, and then Pierce Brosnan and Goldeneye happened in 95, and that's basically the first movie under kind of the new regime of the Broccoli family of Barbara and Michael G. Wilson. And of course, Brosnan famously was supposed to be Bond when Timothy Dalton became Bond, but NBC wouldn't let him out of his Remington Steele contract. So Brosnan eventually becomes Bond. And to me, he's kind of a charming mix of Connery and Moore, with a little more on the Moore side than the Connery side.
If they had a baby, if Roger Moore and Sean Connery had a baby, it would be Pierce Brosnan, yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Much so. And Pierce was everybody was rooting for, because people wanted him to get it for Living Daylights, and when they felt he was robbed, and he was, when NBC renewed Remington Steele. He lost the role after being given it. So now it was like coming home. It was like, finally, this was meant to be. And of course, Goldeneye was a huge success, taking not only the studio by surprise, but Hollywood in general. It was much more successful than anyone expected, because everyone was starting to feel like James Bond was over. It was your father's franchise. And that, along with the huge success of the Nintendo GoldenEye video game, sort of reaffirmed the potency of the James Bond franchise. The problem was UA United Artists was having financial problems that they've had for 2 decades now, and there was a rush to get Tomorrow Never Dies out to capitalize on the success of Goldeneye, as well as to help the stock valuation to prep the studio for sale. And it shows, because Tomorrow Never Dies, with all due respect to Ed Gross, is a mess, even though I love that movie.
Love that.
And had they had time for development and maybe a little more time to hone the script, I mean, even the reason that interminable stealth boat stuff goes on, because they built it and because they had nothing else to shoot. And if you look at some of the early drafts of that movie, it just never gets there. And then, World Is Not Enough. It's been said, and I think in our book by some people, and I think it's true, he's the best Bond in search of a good script. It's like, basically, he's a guy, Pierce is a guy who never had a good James Bond script. He was a great Bond who never had a good James Bond script. And it's true, because as Ed alluded to earlier, Die Another Day is a completely schizophrenic movie. It starts off, it's great. He gets captured in North Korea. He escapes. He goes rogue. He goes to Cuba. There's this wonderful scene with this actor, Rene Echeverria. Yeah, I don't know.
No,
Cuba.
Writer. Rene Echeverria is the writer.
And it's a terrific sequence. And then there's this great mano a mano sword fighting scene at a club in the UK, and it's all great. It's firing on all cylinders. And then we meet the invisible car, and from then on out to the point where he's taken to Toby Stevens takes him to a little science demonstration in Iceland. The movie becomes Moonraker times 10, and it's just awful. And I've never a Bond movie like self-destruct worse. Like in real time, you're watching the movie like completely self-destruct, and it's really sad, because ultimately it was a huge success, and then Pierce still gets shown the door because they don't know where to go from there, and they cast Daniel Craig as James Bond in Casino Royale, which they had just gotten the rights back to from Sony.
I think one thing you need to talk about too with those movies is, and I know the term Bond girl is kind of looked down on in this day and age, but the Pierce Brosnan era was kind of the rise of very strong female characters in these films, including Judi Dench as M, and Famke Janssen as the villainess in Goldeneye, and I always forget her name, who was basically the other woman in Goldeneye, Isabella. Yeah. And that continues into Tomorrow Never Dies. Not so much into World Is Not Enough, but definitely with Halle Berry in Die Another Day too.
Yeah, that's a point. I mean, look, Dame Judi Dench she's very proud of being a Bond girl. And Bond girl is a brand. It's a printer. Some people call it Bond woman. But yeah, clearly with Barbara Broccoli at the helm of one of the most important movie franchises of all time, the day for shrinking violets and eye candy was over. And thankfully, and so you have a great Bond villainess in Goldeneye, and Famke Janssen as Xena Onatopp, but you also have Isabella Scorupco, who is very resourceful heroine as well in that movie. And it continues with Mai Lin, with the great Michelle Yeoh in Tomorrow Never Dies. Is probably the best thing about that movie. And in fact, there had been talk of doing a spin-off with her character, but she's just so wonderful. And then you go on to World's Not Enough, and they really paid the price, because ultimately you have this great Bond villainess in Sophie Marceau. So the problem is they go with a more traditional Bond girl, and Denise Richards as a nuclear scientist, and that in a way,
don't forget
Christmas Jones. So that kind of was the death of that movie, because you can't really get away with Denise Richards in crop tops and shorts as a nuclear scientist. Now, I'm sure there are some beautiful nuclear scientists running around in crop tops and shorts, but for whatever reason, it just doesn't feel credible in this movie. And in Die Another Day, absolutely, Halle Berry is among the best of the Bond girls, because she is just as resourceful and just as kick-ass and the equal of James Bond, and she's terrific, and she's ahead of him most of the movie. movie. But then, of course, she has to be rescued by James Bond because it's a James Bond movie. But she's great. And, the evolution of the female characters continues into the Daniel Craig era, which is, kind of a law of diminishing returns, because Casino Royale is probably, in the top 2-3 Bond movies of all time. I mean, it's just a remarkable film, and Eva Green is spectacular, and everything about it. Martin Campbell directs that movie with complete assurance, and it's an incredible film. And really, it's all downhill from there.
But how about the fact that Martin Campbell gets to reboot the James Bond franchise twice?
He's you can't underestimate his importance to the franchise. I mean, I was lucky enough to spend a couple of hours talking to him. He was a great interview. He's very proud of what he accomplished with these Bond movies. And for him to pull off what he did in GoldenEye and then do it again with Casino Royale, even better, is amazing. And you can't underestimate, what he brought to that franchise. Bond fans know Martin Campbell a lot. He is the Terrence Young of contemporary James Bond. The way Terrence Young sort of created the James Bond template in Dr. No and From Russia with Love, and really made Sean Connery into James Bond, because people say Terrence Young was the real James Bond. He took this blue collar weightlifter delivery man that was Sean Connery and took him to his tailor in Savile Row and taught him how to eat and how to play golf and do all this stuff. And Martin Campbell, just knew exactly how to direct Pierce, exactly how to work with Daniel Craig. And you can't give Barbara Broccoli her credit when no one thought Daniel Craig was right. No one thought he would be a good Bond. I didn't. She knew. Even Martin Campbell didn't see it at first. And she was insistent that this was the guy, and she was right. She was right.
So that obviously that brings us up to the Daniel Craig era. So let's finish up with talking about him. We only have about 10 minutes left here.
I just want to say about Daniel Craig, it's interesting. Is like, Connery is the Bond I grew up with, and he's my favorite, and I still think he's the best Bond. And when Daniel Craig was coming in, it was kind of like, I don't know. I don't know about this guy. I didn't know what to think. But almost after that opening sequence at Casino Royale, it was like I very quickly started to feel that Connery's got the edge, but Daniel Craig is this close to the edge. I mean, the man embodies Bond. I mean, in an incredible way. Now, maybe not all the scripts have been up to what they should be, but that's always the case. But as far as portraying Bond and bringing Bond to life, he makes you almost forget the rest.
You got that black and white sequence that opens Casino Royale that's spectacular. And you go from that into the parkour sequence, which is even more spectacular. And you're like thinking, oh my God, this is incredible. And then you have this great script that's rewritten by Paul Haggis. And I mean, I put that scene on the train between Daniel Craig and Eva Green up there with the greats, like North by Northwest. I mean, it's one of those great, scenes between a man and a woman on a train. It goes back to sort of these awesome, iconic train movies that were so characteristic of movies in the 40s and 50s. And it's a throwback, but it feels super contemporary, and it's just awesome. And that movie just works like gangbusters. And, with Quantum of Solace, there was a real effort to sort of do something unique for the Bond franchise, which was to have a continuing story, to literally pick up where Casino Royale leaves off. And it was sort of a noble intention. Wouldn't you agree, Ed? I mean, the thing about Quantum of Solace improves with age. And it works as an epilogue or an appendix to Casino Royale, but on its own merits, it struggles. And part of that has to do with the Mark Forrester, who's a wonderful director, but his style is so dissonant with what came before that it takes a lot of getting used to. The quick cutting, the Jason Bourne kind of approach with the rapid editing that doesn't feel very Bond, starting with that car chase at the very beginning of Quantum. But yet, there's a lot in Quantum that's quite good. Olga Kurylenko is a strong female protagonist. She never sleeps with Bond. Bond has there's some great set pieces, some great action set pieces. Wonderful David Arnold score. And that set piece in with Quantum in the Opera House is one of the great Bond scenes of all time. So, you can't just dismiss Quantum of Solace despite its many flaws.
You need to watch it back to back with Casino Royale. It's a great double feature, actually, because it does, like you said, it's an epilogue, and it really does. Its strength improves if you watch it right after you've seen Casino Royale, because they are kind of one of a whole anyway.
Yeah.
you know.
Now I'm really surprised by all the antipathy to Skyfall, because I like Skyfall, and there are a lot of people I know who are huge Bond fans. For whatever reason, they don't like it, and they really hate the Home Alone ending with Albert Finney. You know, and I get that, because I think Skyfall for its first two acts is really good, and then it stumbles a little bit at the end. It's sort of hard to believe that he would go to this empty house with no weapons to fight off Silva. But and there's a little dark night about it. I planned this whole thing. I knew exactly what you were going to do and when you were going to do it. But that said, it's a nice homage to 50 years of James Bond movies. It's certainly better than the 40-year celebration of Die Another Day. And it's beautifully shot. I mean, the Roger Deakins photography alone, I mean, there's that stunning scene in the skyscraper in Shanghai where he stages that fight scene against the neon billboards. That's remarkable. So, I mean, there's a lot I like about Skyfall. I don't have that kind of antipathy that a lot of people I know have towards it. And it was, it's the most successful in contemporary dollars of any Bond movie, having made over $1 billion worldwide.
It's great. Skyfall, they did an amazing job with Skyfall, I think. I agree it does stumble a bit at the end, but the first two-thirds are so powerful and so strong that you're willing to forgive it.
Yeah, I mean, that whole scene in Macau is great, and then you have the stuff on the abandoned island. I mean, that feels like a Bond, a Bond city. So so then you get to Spectre, and we go back to the super schizophrenic movie. It has this brilliant teaser in Mexico, and it starts off and it's like interesting, it's mysterious. We get Monica Bellucci as a Bond girl who's wonderful, and then it just goes off the rails big time with this idea to suddenly do a shared universe, MCU mythology, where Blofeld is this, Franz Oberhauser, his brother, and he's engineered everything in the previous films for revenge against Bond. I'm the author of all your pain. It's like, what is going on? And that ending, which feels like a bad Mission Impossible, where the whole gang gets involved, M and Moneypenny, and they're all working together to stop. Oh God, I never, as a movie, self-destructed more quickly, other than Die Another Day.
So how much do both of you think that the rise of the Bourne films and Mission Impossible films informed the Daniel Craig movies?
I think a great deal. And I think that you really see it in Quantum of Solace, where it's really trying to be a Bourne film. It's interesting because I think they felt in the late 80s that the emergence of Die Hard and Lethal Weapon had outshone Bond. And they really felt that's why License to Kill didn't work, because they got shown up by these other franchises. Now they had to play catch up. And that's why they were trying to get the directors and writers from those movies to try and right the ship. And it's the same thing here. They feel like Bourne was a better Bond movie than they'd been doing. And then you have the same thing, happen, with Mission Impossible, where, oh my God, these stunts are even bigger and better. So there's a tendency now on Bond to say, okay, we got to make our stunts even bigger and better than Mission Impossible. It's like an arms race. And, but the thing is, Bond's a different kind of franchise, and Bond is a little more grounded, and it's a little more espionage, and it's a little more plotty, and there's a formula. And I think Bond is its best. It's let Bond be Bond. Don't try and be Mission Impossible. Don't try to be the Bourne Identity. Just let Bond be Bond. And when Bond is Bond, nobody does it better.
There's the thing. Quantum of Solace is the most Bourne influenced, I think. Beyond bringing an edge to Bond, returning his edge, that may have been influenced by Bourne as well. But stylistically, Quantum is the guiltiest of trying to be Jason Bourne. But then I think they strip that away, and it keeps the edge of Bond moving forward with Skyfall and, to a much less successful degree, Spectre. So yes, they may have influenced them. Oh shit, we got to watch what we're doing and try to adjust. But they seem to have let that go and go back to what they do best.
So we've come to the end of our time, unfortunately. I think we could do another 2 hours or so on this easily. But I want to take the time to ask you guys to do a little self-promotion and mention your social media accounts. And then hang in there for a minute while I talk about the museum a little bit, and then we'll wrap it up.
You can follow me on at Mark A. Altman on Twitter and Instagram. And you can also listen to our weekly podcast, The 4:30 Movie, where we curate fantasy theme weeks of classic films every week, as well as Inglorious Treksperts, the only Star Trek podcast for Star Trek fans with life, which you can download wherever you listen to podcasts, or on the Electric Now app. You can download the Electric and watch our video podcasts. So I hope you'll join me for some musing on Star Trek and other things, as well as 007. And of course, our book, Nobody Does It Better, is available in hardcover, digital, and audiobook wherever you purchase books.
On Twitter at Ed Gross. I'm also the host of the Closer Weekly Classic TV podcast and the Voices from Krypton podcast, where we speak superhero. And outside of that, that's pretty much it for me.
So for the Comic-Con Museum, if you liked this presentation, or even if you didn't like this presentation, you can email us at museumops@comic-con.org. You can also visit us online at www.comic-con.org/museum, or follow us on social media at Comic-Con Museum on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. And I want to thank Mark and Ed for joining us today for this dive into the world of James Bond and their new book. It's been a lot of fun, guys, and I hope I'll see you soon at some convention of ours in the near future, hopefully, when all this is over. So thank you once again.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, and stay safe and healthy, and we can't wait to see you back in San Diego and Anaheim, whenever that may be.
All right. Thank you, guys.
Take care.
Take care.